everyone. Bryce Newberger. Welcome back to another week of abuse and addiction. Last week was maybe a little bit of a tense week that we had of discussion. Hopefully it should be a little lighter this week. We tasked you guys with playing together. So the first topic that we're going to talk about this week is how did that play go? How was it playing together? Now, first thing I want to talk about is did you learn anything when you were playing together? What came out? And did anyone not play together? Did it just not happen? That's completely understandable. So one thing I'd like to talk about is why didn't you get to play together? But first, let's talk about the importance of play. Let me just add a quick little addendum here. It's so important that people learn how to play because it's so formative for people to overcome addiction. It's finding love and joy in life. And so it's so important to laugh, to play, to tickle, to wrestle, whatever the case may be. A lot of times due to trauma that we suffered or abuse that we suffered as children, which is where a lot of unfortunately, the trauma and abuse happens to us as children, it can override certain things in us. And so, I have a lot of memories as a kid of playing with toys and being creative and imaginative, but those moments were interrupted with pain, abuse, trauma. I remember putting a lot of effort into something as a child that I built this whole Lego thing. I didn't think I was capable of building it. And then amid an argument and some things that happened in my house, it just got shattered and destroyed. And as a child, I didn't really care about the arguing and the yelling and the hitting and all that because I was used to that environment. I cared that the thing I spent so much time on got shattered and destroyed, and that created a little micro abuse in me. It's actually quite a macro abuse in me that affected the way that I model and build and play. And so today, by doing miniatures, as you can see behind me, which is why I'm including some of the stuff, but as I do miniatures and modeling and painting today, I'm overriding that trauma of the past. And so it's important that we learn as couples to play, even just if you're not a couple, but if you're just a single person out there, that you go, to a board game cafe or something. But it's important that you learn to play because that's going to heal some of the traumas that you had as a young child or growing up in life. So take some time to talk amongst each other about playing, and we'll come right back after that. All right, hopefully everyone had a great discussion about playing together. And this is going to lead us into our next topic, which is healing the sexual relationship. So again, this is going to talk pretty specifically to, married couples out there in these studies. But if you're part of this group and you're single, this is going to be important information for when you get married. So, it's like you don't want to be taking the test and then realize that you didn't study at all for it. So this is still very valuable information for single people out there. And so talking about healing the sexual relationship, the reality is we all bring our own baggage into the sexual relationship. We have wounds of abuse, and there's a lot, I'm not going to get Freudian here with how your parents play into that kind of stuff. But the reality is that, again, as we've had abuse in our lives, it's created certain tendencies. And those tendencies, sex is, for those of us who have had it, it's one of the most intimate expressions of a relationship that people have. And if you get that relationship wrong, if you have certain abuses or certain things kind of infiltrating that area, it can wreak massive havoc in the relationship. So first, let's talk about good sex, what sex really is. I have counseled people and I have talked to people who they talked about their sexual relationship in their marriage and how it was just completely selfish, how it was self-centered. It was all based on what kind of gratification they could get out of the other person. And so they really didn't enjoy sex post marriage because their idea of sex was just, it's this really degrading thing. And it's like a competition. It's a time for them to try and, get pleased themselves and to, have to unfortunately do some things maybe they don't want to do to please their partner. And that's just wrong when it comes to what sex was designed to be by God. And so a good expression of a sexual relationship is a time of complete intimacy towards your spouse, towards the person you love the most, and that's your spouse. And it's going to be a time where you're learning them, they're learning you in the most intimately physical and emotional and spiritual way that's possible. Everything's off the table. It's like the most expressive way to communicate with one another, because your spirits are intertwined, your emotions are intertwined, you're physically intertwined, and all of this comes together. And it should be a time of much similar to playing, to laughing, to enjoying one another. It should be pleasurable. And if it's not, it's because there's something wrong with the relationship. So where people get that wrong so many times is they feel like maybe sex is the only way to please their spouse. So we've all heard and seen, and it's all out there in the culture of the husband who always wants sex and the wife who's never giving it to him, and this pull and tug. Now, as someone who's been involved with couples counseling here and there, and counseling young couples, I've seen it go both ways. Sometimes it's the wife. Yeah, man, a lot of times I've seen it was the wife and the husband wasn't too interested, and you think, that's interesting. That kind of violates what we think about about our culture. Maybe it was just the places I was at geographically. I don't know, but some people think that they have to have sex to please their partner, and while there might be a certain extent, like, yeah, your partner wants to have sex, and if you're not having sex with them, that's going to be obviously a letdown for them. But if you're going to have sex merely for the fact that you feel inadequate, or you feel like it's the only way you can please them, and that nothing else you do will please them, that's going to be a problem, and that's gonna be a wound. Most likely born out of past trauma that needs to be examined. And so it's important that you set up boundaries for yourself in the sexual relationship. And now I know I just talked about how there's no boundaries, it's all this great thing, but it's also within the realm of your partner, your spouse's comfortability. And so when I say boundaries, I'm saying if you feel lonely, tired, angry, or afraid, those aren't great times to be intimate, because you're trying to feed those emotions with sex, and so that's not going to be a great time to have sex. And so if you think, I've had a really rough day, I would just like to have some sex, I will pressure my partner into that. That's not a great way to handle that, and so that can create, again, what's known as a coping or survival strategy. And anytime you have a coping or survival strategy, it's building up to an addiction that is going to put something like sex where it shouldn't be, and try to use sex for something it wasn't intended to be used for. So we're going to take a moment to discuss. And again, if you're in a group, I was a pastor in Vegas. Okay. But I'm also raised in Oklahoma. So I get, there's different demographics and churches out there. So if you're a group and you're like, we don't want to talk about sex, here in a group setting, then that's up to you guys, no pressure. But if your group is comfortable, feel free to take some time to discuss. Some of the conversations to discuss would be, what do we think of, or why do we think of sex as a spiritual and emotional feeling for your spouse? So why is it spiritual and emotional if it's a physical act? I think that's a really important discussion. And so if you're married out there and you don't feel comfortable having this discussion in a group, then maybe break off into mini groups by couple. There's one single guy in the corner who's just like, well, no, but maybe on your way home or whatever the case may be, but definitely have this conversation. Why is sex also spiritual and emotional? Have that conversation and really uncover some things about each other. And then let's talk about self-nurturing, right? And so if you are having the feeling like you need to have sex to combat loneliness, tiredness, being angry or afraid, how can you self-nurture in that situation without using sex and without necessarily bringing in your spouse? What are some strategies you can have? Can you turn to prayer? Can you turn to valid coping strategies like grounding yourself and getting healthy exercise, right? These are productive ways that you can feed those tendencies, because what happens is sometimes your body and your mind will tell you that you need something, and it will come up with a wrong solution. I'm feeling a need. Sex must be the appropriate way to feed that. Our bodies are so well designed and programmed to do that naturally, and it's not the right. We always give ourselves the wrong answer, right? I bring this up to mental health. If you're depressed, you feel like, man, I need to sit on the couch because I'm depressed. No, you need to get up and walk around because you're depressed. I'm anxious, I need to pace around and take a jog. No, you're anxious, you need to sit down and ground yourself. And so our bodies can be counterintuitive, and sex is much the same way. You think, oh, I really need some sex, and it's not that's not always the right case. And so taking self-inventory, talking about self-nurturing, this is an important part of the process of healing. And the core key concept here is you want to keep sex in the right space. You don't want to abuse sex. So you want to make sure that you're using it as God intended for the right purpose. And then, yes, it can be a wonderful, magical, pleasurable experience. It can be the best thing you possibly do with your spouse when you treat it appropriately. And I've seen this in couples counseling versus couples who had a Christ-centered relationship with sex, and sex was all about pleasing the other person, getting to know the other person, and really the most beautiful form of communicating with the other person, versus people who were like, and a lot of times it was couples, no shame out there, but there's a lot of couples who had sex through high school, sex, in college, and had really a bad sexual relationship growing up, and then they carried that into marriage, and they didn't fix those kind of bad sexual concepts, and sex actually becomes very unenjoyable for those people. So take some time to talk amongst yourselves. If you don't feel like talking, then don't pause the video and just go right on to the next question. But for everyone else, I'll give them a quick break here. All right, welcome back. Hopefully you guys had a great, not awkward at all conversation about sex. But now we're going to talk about how to deal with codependency issues. And so this is also so important when it comes to sex as well. This is kind of a sex talk part 2, but it's also just relationship advice in general. And usually couples that are together and there's a lot of addiction involved in the marriage, usually what ends up happening is both spouses have a sense of codependency. Now, that's not always the case, but it's worth taking self-inventory on that to see, do I have codependency issues? The biggest thing is to ask yourself, are you willing to lose your marriage? Because if you're not willing to lose your marriage, then you're not going to have the strength to put it back together again. What a crazy statement. What a crazy statement. Let me explain that statement to you. If you're not willing to lose your marriage, you won't have the tools or the will to put it back together again. And what's so important with that is to say that if your intimacy and codependency issues go hand in hand because you're afraid of losing your partner. You're afraid of losing your spouse. And if you think, I can't survive without them, I can't live without them, I'll do anything to keep them, then you're not going to have the wherewithal to ask the hard questions, to tell the truth, to speak honestly, because you're always going to sacrifice honesty for keeping your partner. Think about that. That's one thing I really struggled with in my marriage, and it turned out I lost the marriage anyway. So what's really, honesty is more important than your need or your feelings of codependency. And so you may be afraid to open up or share or be honest, to let the person know who you really are, because you think if they really knew who I was, if they really knew what I was thinking, if they really knew what I've done, I will lose them. But the reality is, where there is deceit and where there is darkness, mold grows and festers. And where darkness is left unchecked, death, it gives birth to death eventually when it fully grows. And so it's so important to have the courage to risk losing your marriage, because you might lose it anyways, because you have to have the courage to honestly step out and have the best marriage you could possibly have. You've got to have the courage to be honest with your spouse and to be honest with your partner, or to be honest with your family members, to go, step away from sex and to talk about, back to friendship and family and these other relationships. You've got to be willing to be honest and be yourself with people to ever be truly known. Right? And that doesn't mean, part of being truly known means that there's warts and all, there's flaws. And so sometimes you might have to fix one of those flaws, and you might say, this is who I really am. And it's not like, this is who I really am, accept me carte blanche. It's like, this is who I really am. And someone might say, oh, there's some problems in there. Can we work on those things? And so you have to be willing to do that. And here's why codependency really is the enemy of God in your relationship with God, is because the only relationship you truly need is a relationship with Jesus. Jesus plus nothing, not your spouse, not your children, not anyone. Now, It's so interesting as I've contemplated scriptures, right, where Jesus says, I've not come to bring peace, but a sword. What? Yes, a sword to divide mother and brother, mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. That one makes sense. And so and then it's like, what? And then Jesus says, whoever chooses family over me is unworthy of me, right? What does that mean? I really contemplated that while going through divorce because what's important to realize is God established the family. God created the family unit. So he's not anti-family. He's not trying to destroy your family. He's not saying I've come with a sword to kill your family and separate you and I'm pro-divorce. No, God instituted marriage. He's obviously against divorce. He doesn't want it. Even within the allowances, again, he's like, hey, there's allowances for this, but it's better you stick together. But God is pro-family unit. He created the family unit. But codependency, choosing your family over God, will inhibit your relationship with God. And if your relationship is inhibited with God, then it will hurt your relationship with your family, your spouse, your children, all of that, right? And so whoever seeks to gain their life will lose it. Whoever loses their life for Christ's sake will gain it. And that's the same thing with your family unit. If you are willing to give up your spouse for the sake of your walk with God and honesty, then you will gain your spouse. Now, let's just talk about my walk. My spouse did leave me and divorce me, and that relationship isn't looking repairable. I still, trust in God. He can do all things. But I believe, whether it's her or someone else in the future, I will gain a spouse, a godly given, Christ-centered focused spouse. And that'll be better for life altogether because walking through this life, it's great to have a partner who's you're equally yoked with, right? And so it's so important to run the risk of being yourself, to defeat codependency, to fix your relationship with God and fix your relationship with your spouse and significant other and family. So take some time to talk about codependency and the fear. So talk about codependency and what your thoughts are and how that interplays with your relationship with God. Talk about some of the verses we brought up. Maybe look them up yourself. And let's have a good discussion about codependency, and we will be right back here in a moment. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you've had a great conversation about codependency issues and just how it affects your relationship with your family, your children, your spouse, God. Now we're going to talk about shame and the ideal relationship and how those two interplay with one another. So first of all, everyone think, what is the ideal relationship? Take a second to talk amongst each other. So pause this video and talk amongst each other. What's your concept of the ideal relationship? Go ahead and have that conversation. I'll wait. All right. Hopefully you guys have had a great conversation about the ideal relationship. Hopefully you paused the video and talked about it. How does the ideal relationship inspire shame? How does that concept of an ideal relationship, how does that get in the way of or inspire shame in your lives? For me, I remember being a young married person and working so hard for my wife, going to work and doing all these things. And I thought about all the strengths I brought to the table. I was slow to anger. I was Christ-centered and Christ-focused. But a young wife was giving me comparison issues, right? This husband does this husband does this husband does this, and that really hurt me. And to her extreme credit, I eventually confronted her and said, hey, I know you're hearing these stories of these other husbands, and I'm not as good at fixing a dishwasher or doing that kind of stuff. But I love Jesus. I work hard for this family. I do a lot of things. And when you compare me to those other people, you don't know their story. Are they having, Bible studies with their family? Are they Christ focused? Are they slow to anger? Or are they berating their wives? Do they talk about her behind? You don't know. And so it's not really fair to compare me, a real person, to a sentence that some wife told you, oh, my husband does this. And then you take that and you build this paragon and you hold me to the standard. That shames me, that hurts me. And so, to my wife's credit, she stopped really playing that comparison game. And that was a big benefit to our marriage early on. And so, let's talk about what a realistic relationship is. A realistic relationship means that two people are flawed and broken, but what can they do good? Well, they can focus on Christ. When they are out of alignment with God's will, one of them can, if you read the book like Love and Respect, I'm sure a lot of our church couples have, you can break that crazy cycle. Someone has to step out and break that crazy cycle and step back into alignment. It's funny because I was in a young couples counseling or session much like this one, talking about the book Love and Respect, when my wife and I were in a really bad situation. We had lost 2 children, and there was cheating in the marriage and stuff had just gone wrong. And we were talking about love and respect, and I was like, I think this only works if someone in the relationship is willing to be actually good spirited. If the other person really just does hate the other person and wants to destroy them, you're gonna have a problem. And that goes back to codependency, and that goes back to being your real self and being open, so you can find out what kind of person you're actually married to. But a realistic relationship is ugly, right? The ideal doesn't actually exist. I really do feel like my marriage accomplished a lot of those ideals. I look back and I go, man, we fought very little. We enjoyed each other a lot. We were focused on Christ. And then here we are divorced. And so we gave a lot of counseling to other couples, and I kind of scratched my head and look back, where did I go wrong? I've spent, thousands and thousands of dollars on, Christian therapy, counseling, secular therapy, just to see what they had to say, clinical psychologists and all that. And what I began to see is like, no, even a relationship where if you were to sit in that home and think this is all great, there's a lot of things that you're unaware of. I wasn't confronting my abuse. I didn't like to fight with my wife. I was extremely codependent on her. And so I let a lot of things fester in that. And so the ideal relationship really doesn't exist. Even great relationships have a host of issues that they're perhaps not aware of and will eventually come up later in their lives. They might have a season of greatness, and you might think they really are a great couple. I went to dinner with them. They know they really are. I hear them talk. And everything could be good for a season, but everyone is flawed. No one is Jesus. No one is the Holy Trinity of a relationship in complete harmony and unity. And so every relationship has their issues. And so it's important to give grace. And so talk about some realistic goals and worthy ideals for your relationships. Realistic goals are like, hey, when I'm a jerk, I want to get back into alignment with you and say that I'm sorry, right? Unrealistic goal might be like a husband, like, I want to have sex every night. And it's like, that's not realistic, So come up, and all those goals and ideals are going to be specific per couple. And as long as they're rooted in Scripture and Christ, and you guys are coming together and saying, we believe these are worthy ideals for God, then come up with them, try them, and don't be afraid to throw them out if they don't work or they turn out not to be realistic. This can be a shifting thing. It's not like we set this standard 5 years ago and we're going to hold the line here in our marriage. It can be a living document, but go ahead and take some time to talk about realistic goals and ideals for your couples or for the couples. And so we're going to take some time, talk amongst each other, and spend some time coming up with some realistic ideals and goals. All right, and in this next section, we're going to talk about a few topics all kind of lumped together for, just more expedient discussion because we don't have all day. But these are important. These are important conversations. First, I want to talk about reverting. What's going to happen is you guys are going to make some progress, and you're going to really put in some intention, and then probably one person or another, it's probably both of you eventually, but someone's going to get tired, and they're going to revert back to old patterns of behavior or slip into old addictions, for those who are dealing with severe addictions. And so when it comes to reverting back to old patterns of behavior, again, it's important that, and we're going to talk in the next few weeks about confronting, and that might require a confrontation and intervention. We're going to talk about that in the weeks to come. But it's going to require grace, love, going back to those ideals, being honest. If you catch someone, a spouse, not being their genuine selves, like, hey, we talked about who you really were, and I see you masking these things. Or if you catch yourself doing it, say, hey, sorry, past few days I was masking, I wasn't being genuine because, again, codependency or, fear of intimacy. And so it's, you got to go back and just keep a lookout for not reverting back. It's important to note that we live in a cycle, right? As we know, no one goes in a fully upward trajectory. It's like, you kind of go up a little bit and then you fall back down, and you go up a little bit and you fall back down. And hopefully over time, you're not falling all the way back down, but you're actually gaining ground in the long run. But it's very rarely a linear process for people. It's usually a cycle that moves you forward over a long period of a lot of effort. let's talk about if you don't work on your relationship, if you don't work on your issue. So again, going back to people who are thinking like, maybe my relationship's just too far gone. Maybe I should never talk to this friend again. Maybe I should get a divorce. Maybe I should just be done with my family. Well, again, if you're not willing to put in the work to interact with these people, we've got to, this goes back to taking mutual responsibility and co-addiction. Remember that you've got to acknowledge that there's something in you that got in this relationship, or there's been stuff put on you or in you through being in these relationships, and you've really got to confront them. I really want to inspire people in your relationships to have that same kind of resolve. Is if you're going to give up so easily on this person, then you might have an easier time letting go of the next person and an easier time letting go of the next person, right? So we don't want you to get divorced 8 times in a row because you didn't deal with what in you picked that kind of person, and you accidentally pick the same kind of person again because you never see it coming, and you think, oh, here's another one of those relationships, dump it and move on, and then perhaps you leave in your wake just a series of broken families. It's also not fair to those people who are struggling with these issues and trying to find healing, and you kind of sign up with them and, hey, I'm committed to you, and then you're like, no, I'm not, and you leave. And so you really want to build within you that resolve. Let's talk about social support. When you open up to other people about this, people can be, very not helpful when it comes to dealing with addiction and these kind of things. People view their own lives with rose-colored glasses. And so the fact that you're in this group putting in the effort to work on your relationship and to get better and to deal with abuse, deal with trauma, deal with addiction, well, I can tell you from firsthand experience, it is very, very hurtful to acknowledge you're going through this process to people outside who are not on this process, and they will, probably some of them with the best intentions, just look down on you completely because they don't realize their own abuse, their own addictions, their own shortcomings, and they think that they've got their lives together, and they hear that you're working on yourselves and they think they're perfect. And so you're going to run into that out there. So I want to encourage you guys, this is a very sensitive time where you're stepping out, you're having courage, and it takes a lot of work to do this. And so I want to encourage you guys, maybe don't be open to everyone about it. Protect who you share this process with. Sometimes that can especially be friends and family, because sometimes friends and family can be really rough, for some people out there. So I don't want you to get discouraged. And so that doesn't mean, hide and have a secret life and don't have a community, don't reach out to people. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm just saying be mindful, because it takes a lot of courage to open up to your spouse and be yourself, to open up to your, to the people, these relationships you're working on, and to be yourself and to destroy codependency issues and intimacy issues. And if you kind of open about, you're going to get excited because you're gaining some ground here, and you're going to tell people, I'm doing this thing, this is great. And be careful who you invite into that process, because those people can really destroy your confidence. And right now, your confidence, for a lot of us out there, I know I'm one of them, it's your confidence is going to be very fragile, and so you want to protect that. And then let's talk about children. What do you do with your children through this process as you're going through this? Do you tell your children, hey, especially those with severe addiction, do you tell your children about the addiction, everything going on? I think everyone should make their own decision on that. I'm not here to tell you how to raise your kids, right? But what I can tell you is what I believe is beneficial, and you can just take my advice and opinion with a grain of salt, right? And pray about it and come up with your own decision for your family. But what I would say is the balance that I found, especially talking to my children going through divorce and these kind of things, especially young children. My kids were, at the time of the divorce, they were 9, 7, and 2, so really young kids. And they watched unfortunately, I got divorced on the back of their uncle dying. And so that really was a catalyst for a lot of this. But so their uncle dies, their 4 cousins are left without a dad, and then their family falls apart. And so when it comes to involving children in these kind of things, be mindful. I've seen families, I definitely grew up in a family where my mother was very happy to tear down my father in front of me. And she was very happy to be like, he's a horrible man who's done horrible things, and you need to know that he's a shameful man. And my dad, was very quick to be like, I deserve it. I messed up. I'm bad. But I needed to know that I could trust my dad. I needed to know that I had a good father figure. And the reality is, yes, my dad made a horrible mistake. There was an affair, I think while I was being born. It was bad. But there was a lot of strength in my dad. He owned his mistake. He hung in there for his family. He went to work every day. He dealt with, a spouse who was completely broken because of his actions and would physically attack him. And he would bear the weight of that. And there was a lot to look up in my dad, but unfortunately, it was constantly communicated to me as a child that, he's an addict, he's a bad person, he's not worth looking up to. And I idolized my dad. And so what did that do to a child? And so, really think about those things as you're walking through your family. It's not about lying to your children. Of course, I was so happy when, I shouldn't say so happy, but it was very good that my dad sat me down when I was older and walked me through the entire process of his moral failure, because that does teach me a lesson. And he's making sure that his mistake has purpose and meaning by handing that to his children, saying, don't do this, don't go that way. And that's what we do in life, right? When it's not abject moral failure, it's like, don't go this way, kids, because I did that and it didn't work. You want to pass that on to your kids. And so it was important that my dad did that. So as you're involving children in this process, it's very important that you're not destroying their relationship with you, and their mother or father or wherever the case may be. So protect the children. It's not an invitation to lie to them, but give the information in due time when it's ready, and make sure also that they do know that they do have a mother or father who's willing to stick in there, put in the support, who loves them completely. So these are all important things to talk about. If you guys want, we can stop here and you guys can kind of talk about these things amongst yourselves, or we can just move on to the next video. Either way, we'll hit a stopping point right here for a second. All right, hopefully everyone maybe had a little conversation about some of those aspects we just talked about. There's a lot to discuss there. Otherwise, for some of you who maybe talked longer than the others, you're just pushing on. That's all okay. Just make sure you circle back around those things throughout the week before we meet again to just kind of meditate on these things. This last one is a commitment to grow spiritually together, right? Again, the theme is partnering together, or partnering and healing, part 2. We want to grow spiritually together. And so there is something I've seen that couples can do in these therapies, and that's to create a spiritual quest contract. And that is sometimes they renew their wedding vows, or they write a contract or have communion, whatever the case may be, and they commit to a spiritual journey together. This can be a really important formative step for a couple to say, hey, we are going to be dedicated to this process. And sometimes those processes or contracts can be a good way to steal some resolve. Again, like I talked about, sometimes your confidence can be a little fragile while you're doing the work of putting your life, yourself, and your relationship back together. One thing I want to point out about a spiritual contract, I think it's great to do that. I think it's so worthwhile. I would have loved to have done something like that with my wife. I've seen couples do that. I'm always for it. But it's important that this is taken out of a pure heart inspired towards healing. Do not turn this into an empty, vain religious practice, right? Do not use this contract as a way to pressure your spouse or pressure the other person as like, hey, you agreed to this, you have to do it, right? That's not going to work, right? Psalm 51, 16 through 17 says, you do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it to you. You do not take pleasure in burnt offerings. My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. You, God, will not despise the broken and contrite heart. So what it's saying is, for a contract to actually work, it's got to be a sincere commitment from a broken heart that is committed to restoration in the things of God. If you're just going to, hey, let's do this contract so we have a piece of paper to wave at each other and shake at each other, that's not going to be good. So I want people to commit to grow spiritually together, right? That means focusing on one-on-one time with God and couples time with God, right? And to grow spiritually together, to spend time in Scripture, go to church together, keep coming to these, biblically based studies on abuse and addiction, maybe even serve together somewhere in the church, whatever the case may be. But do not feel compelled to do this. And this can actually be a damaging thing. This can actually be negative for people. It can hurt people if they have a history of maybe emotional or spiritual abuse in their lives, where people have used words and commitments like this to abuse them. And so a lot of people, especially women, I've noticed, kind of grow up in that where they're led astray by, beguiling men or people in ministry or whatever, by putting religious pressure on them. And so if you're going to do this, if you have a history of religious pressure or religious abuse or emotional abuse, that kind of thing where you feel pressured into doing things, this might be a step that you skip. I think it's really good to make a spiritual. You should definitely grow spiritually together, but I'm talking about the spiritual quest contract, that, and this commitment of renewing your vows and all that. You might have to be honest with your spouse, with your significant other, with people in the process, and say, hey, I see the value in that, but this is a hurt or an abuse or a trauma that I've had in the past, and I feel like if I did it, it would be disingenuous to do a contract here, because it would basically prey upon your past abuse and lead you into that religious addiction or codependency addiction, that kind of thing. So definitely grow spiritually together, but when it comes to formalizing that, maybe do, maybe don't. It may or may not be a great idea to focus on that. Guys, we will wrap up here, but that to be said, you can still pause and talk about that spiritual contrast. You can talk about religious addiction or religious abuse, and that could be definitely a rewarding conversation to still have with one another. Just to wrap up, though, take some time to take inventory through some of these things we talked about with healing the sexual relationship, playing together, writing down the ideal relationship. And so there's been a few actionable items. And so for the homework this week, again, do it or don't do it, whatever, but the more you want to get out of this, that's on you. But some actionable items is you guys can talk about growing spiritually together and what does that look like. You can talk about realistic relationships and write down some good goals and ideas for a realistic relationship. Those are going to be two big actionable items this week that you can think on and ponder on. Guys, thank you so much for joining this study. I am so excited to see you next week. I'm Bryce Newberger, and you guys have a God bless day. All right, bye-bye.